Picture a single room, not an arena, not a dojo with mirrored walls and polished floors. A back room behind a gymnasium in Los Angeles, 1967, smelling of liniment oil and cigarette smoke. The fluorescent light overhead hums at exactly the wrong frequency. There are 6 people in that room. 6. And one of them, the most decorated full-contact fighter in the United States, a man who had broken bones with his hands and walked away without apology, is sitting on the edge of a folding metal chair. His forearms are resting on his knees. His head is down. He is not injured. He is not tired. He is thinking. Across from him stands a man who weighs 138 pounds, 5 feet 7 inches tall. He is still wearing the street clothes he arrived in, dark slacks, a plain collared shirt, nothing that signals what he is. He hasn't raised his voice once in the last 4 minutes. He hasn't thrown a single strike. He has only moved twice, and each time, the larger man's body responded before his mind could catch up. The 6 people in that room will carry what happened next for the rest of their lives. Most of them never spoke about it publicly. One of them, the man in the folding chair, would wait nearly a decade before telling his closest students. And when he finally did, he used only one sentence. He said, "Bruce Lee is the most dangerous human being I have ever encountered." This is that story. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand the world Joe Louis occupied in 1967. And you have to understand it precisely, because vague admiration is the enemy of honest history. Joseph Louis was 22 years old that year. He stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 207 pounds of structured, disciplined muscle. He had studied Shorin-ryu karate in Okinawa while serving as a U.S. Marine, training under masters who did not award rank for attendance. He had then returned stateside and begun competing immediately, and the results were not gradual. They were immediate and absolute. In 1966 alone, Louis won every major full-contact karate tournament he entered on the West Coast circuit. His fighting record at the time of this story stood at 61 matches, 61 victories, with 39 ending before the final round. 39. His right leg, his primary weapon, had generated force measurements that training partners described not as kicks, but as collisions with furniture. The date was a Thursday in late autumn, November 9th, 1967. The location was the back section of Jim Kelly's gymnasium on West Olympic Boulevard in Los Angeles, a facility that served as an unofficial hub for California's competitive martial arts community. It was approximately 7:15 in the evening. The main floor was still running a conditioning class. You could hear the rhythmic thud of focus mitts through the wall, a metronome of violence keeping time in the background. Louis had arrived at 45 minutes past 6 with 2 training partners and an instructor he'd been consulting for footwork refinement. He was preparing for the All-American Karate Championships, scheduled for 6 weeks out, and he had heard, through the specific and reliable grapevine of the California martial arts circuit, that someone connected to this gym might offer him a genuinely interesting technical problem. That word, interesting, was how serious fighters described opponents they respected before the match and often feared afterward. Louis moved through the world with a particular kind of authority that comes not from arrogance, but from evidence. He had proven himself so many times, in so many rooms, against so many different systems, that his confidence was not performance. It was data. He knew what a punch felt like before it landed, knew which angles of attack were viable against his defense, knew the specific body mechanics of every major style he had encountered. Shotokan, Tang Soo Do, Taekwondo. He had absorbed them all, cataloged their patterns, and filed them under manageable. That evening, standing in his gray training pants and Marine Corps t-shirt, he scanned the back room with the measured efficiency of a man taking inventory. He noted the space, roughly 18 feet by 22 feet, 2 folding tables pushed against the far wall, a stack of wrestling mats in the corner. He noted the 5 other people present. He noted the one man he did not immediately recognize. But here's where it changes. Louis looked at that unrecognized man for exactly the time it took his brain to categorize and dismiss. Slight build, calm posture, no visible training calluses from this angle, civilian clothes. He moved on. He began wrapping his hands from a roll of athletic tape in his bag. He had already mentally filed the small man in the collared shirt under irrelevant. He would spend years thinking about that moment of dismissal. Bruce Lee had arrived 11 minutes earlier, alone, carrying nothing. No training bag. No sparring gear. He had come because of mutual contact. A man named David Tadman, who served as an informal connector between the separate worlds of Hollywood stunt work and competitive martial arts, had asked him to look at something. The something was Joe Louis's left side defensive gap, a structural problem in his guard that nobody had successfully exploited yet because nobody had been fast enough or precise enough to make it matter. Bruce stood near the door and did not introduce himself immediately. This was not shyness. It was methodology. He watched Louis wrap his hands. He watched the way Louis's shoulders settled when he exhaled. He watched the angle of Louis's feet during a casual weight shift. The way the big man's center of gravity sat perhaps a centimeter too far back for optimal reaction time. 3 minutes of observation is worth 20 minutes of conversation when you know what you are looking for. His knuckles were the first signal, if anyone had been looking. The lateral edge of his right hand, the blade, the knife-edge surface from the base of the small finger to the wrist, was layered with callus so dense it had changed the skin's color to a pale, almost translucent gray. Not from bag work, from years of conditioning against hard surfaces. A Wing Chun practice called Dan Chi that Bruce had begun at 13 under the instruction of Ip Man in Hong Kong, drilling the hand's impact surfaces against wood until the nerve endings rebuilt themselves into something closer to insulation than sensation. His knuckles themselves showed the record of 10,000 repetitions, possibly 20,000. The number stopped matching somewhere around year 4. He was still. Not the stillness of someone waiting, the stillness of someone already arrived. David Tadman finally crossed the room and said something quiet to Joe Louis, who looked up from his tape job and then looked across at Bruce. For a moment, Louis's expression was genuinely neutral. He didn't recognize the face. Competitive martial arts in 1967 had not yet fully bridged into mainstream visibility. Bruce Lee had appeared in the Green Hornet television series that year, but Louis didn't watch much television, and he certainly didn't catalog actors. Then one of Louis's training partners, a man named Rudy Limmer, who competed in the lightweight divisions and possessed considerably more cultural range than his training partners, said 3 words from the corner of the room. He said, "That's Bruce Lee." Louis looked again, and what happened next, nobody expected. Louis nodded once, the nod of a man acknowledging a name he recognizes, but a face that hasn't yet connected to the name's reputation. He went back to his tape. He said, without particular emphasis, "Cool." Bruce Lee, from across the room, watched this happen, and the faintest movement crossed his face, not quite a smile. Something more precise than a smile. Recognition of a familiar equation. The formal conversation began approximately 12 minutes after Bruce's arrival. Tadman served as the connector, explaining that he had invited Bruce to observe and potentially offer some technical input on Louis's defensive positioning. This was a reasonable request in theory. In practice, it contained a specific friction that anyone in the room could have predicted. Joe Louis did not accept technical input from people who had not demonstrated a right to offer it. He was not cruel about this. He was simply operating from a coherent system of values. You earn the right to teach by demonstrating that you can do. He had seen too many theorists, men with impressive terminology and no scar tissue, occupy too much valuable training time with corrections that evaporated under actual pressure. He turned to face Bruce directly. He said, with the specific courtesy of a man who is about to be impolite, "I appreciate you coming down. What system do you work in?" Bruce said several. Louis's jaw shifted slightly. That was not the answer of a traditionalist, and Louis was, in certain precise ways, a traditionalist. He believed in the integrity of lineage, in the chain of transmission from master to student that gave technique its authority. Several was the answer of someone who had sampled without committing, and Louis had seen that type before. Impressive looking, structurally shallow. He said, "Can you be more specific?" Bruce said, "I can show you, if that's more useful." The room shifted. There were 6 people present: Louis, his 2 training partners, Limmer, Tadman, and a man named Carlos Ruiz, who was a trainer, not a fighter, and who would later describe this moment as the one time in his 30 years working with athletes that he felt the temperature of a room change without anyone touching the thermostat. Lewis's lead training partner, a man named Wayne Horton, himself a regional champion with a 28-4 record, put a hand on Lewis's shoulder and said something that the available accounts record only as a caution, a suggestion to slow down. Lewis moved his shoulder away from the hand without looking at it. He said to Bruce, "All right, what are you proposing?" Bruce looked at the room. He looked at the space between the two folding tables and the far wall. He said, "I'd like to demonstrate one technique. One, on you, with your permission, at whatever speed you're comfortable with." Lewis said, "Full speed." Bruce said, "Of course." The word "of course" arrived without drama. Tadman later said it was the flattest two-word phrase he had ever heard, stripped of every possible reading except literal agreement. He said it the way a carpenter might say "of course" when asked if he wants to use the good lumber. It was simply the obvious answer. Ruiz moved toward the door instinctively, not to leave, but to get slightly out of the way. He said afterward that he moved without deciding to move. His body made the decision, and that's when the crowd went silent. In martial arts, most confrontations have a grammar. There is a settling period, a circling, a series of feints and tests that establish the range and the rhythm before anyone commits to a real technique. This grammar exists because commitment is expensive. If you commit and miss, you have spent energy and revealed a pattern, and a good opponent will make you pay for both. Bruce Lee's approach to this grammar was to eliminate it. He stood approximately 11 feet from Joe Louis. His feet were in what appeared to be a casual stance, left foot forward, weight distributed without obvious bias, hands loose at approximately mid-chest height. Nothing in his posture telegraphed an intention. This was not accidental. Every element of his standing position had been engineered over 14 years of daily practice to contain zero readable information. Lewis took a balanced fighting stance. He raised his hands to a standard guard, left hand forward at chin height, right hand at cheekbone level, elbows angled down to protect the ribs. His feet were shoulder-width apart, weight fractionally forward, prepared to cover distance in either direction. This was an excellent guard. It had survived 61 matches. In the first second, nothing happened. This was the technique. The first second was not a pause before the technique. The first second was the technique's opening movement, a controlled stillness designed to create one specific cognitive event in the opponent's nervous system. When a highly trained fighter faces a threat and nothing happens, his threat detection system doesn't relax. It searches. It begins scanning, eyes moving fractionally across the threat's surface looking for the tell, the shoulder drop, the hip rotation, the weight transfer that precedes movement. That scanning process has a cost. It distributes attention rather than concentrating it. Bruce was waiting for the distribution. In the second he moved. Not forward. Laterally, 3 inches to his left. A movement so small it should have registered as irrelevant. At 6 feet 1 inch, Joe Louis's vision processed a minor adjustment and recalculated angles. His guard shifted perhaps 4 degrees right to compensate. That 4-degree shift was precisely what Bruce had been waiting for. What happened in the third second requires the vocabulary of Jeet Kune Do to describe accurately, and even that vocabulary reaches its limits quickly. Bruce's centerline theory, the principle that the most efficient path to an opponent's vulnerable center runs along the straight line between two bodies, meant that the lateral step had not been evasion. It had been geometry. By moving 3 inches left, he had changed the angle of the centerline to his advantage, without Louis perceiving the change as a threat. His right hand moved along that new centerline at a speed that multiple accounts estimated between 4 and 5 meters per second, roughly the documented speed of his 1-inch punch, a technique that had been tested and filmed and was already becoming legendary in certain specific circles. The hand did not strike. It stopped 1 centimeter from Louis's sternum. Wayne Horton, watching from 8 feet away, said afterward that he saw the hand arrive. He said he did not see it leave. Louis's body responded before his conscious mind processed the input. His knees bent. Not from impact. There was no impact. From the kinetic chain reaction of a nervous system that had received a signal moving faster than its interrupt rate. His weight dropped 3 inches before his mental assessment caught up with his physical response and arrested the fall. He straightened. His face was entirely still. The room held its breath for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time. Long enough for Carlos Ruiz to become aware that he had been holding his breath since before the movement happened. Long enough for Rudy Limmer to look at Wayne Horton and see that Horton was looking at exactly the same point in space. Both of them focused on the spot where something had passed without passing. But here's where it changes again. Bruce stepped back. One step. He lowered his hand to his side. He did not look at Lewis the way a victor looks at a defeated opponent. He looked at Lewis the way a diagnostician looks at a patient after confirming a hypothesis. Not with satisfaction, but with the particular focused interest of someone who has just identified the next question. Lewis exhaled. The sound of that exhale, a single, controlled breath through the nose, was the loudest thing in the room. He said, in a voice from which he had carefully removed every possible inflection, "Do that again." Bruce said, "The same technique won't work twice against you." The silence that followed this statement lasted 7 seconds. Wayne Horton counted them afterward, reconstructing the moment because he needed to be sure he had heard what he heard. 7 seconds. In 7 seconds, Joe Louis, 61 wins, 39 by stoppage, the most decorated full-contact karate fighter on the West Coast of the United States, processed the fact that the man across from him had not shown him what he could do. He had shown him the smallest possible sample, one movement, one angle, chosen specifically because it would not be available again. That's not a technique. That's a philosophy with a fist attached. And that was only the beginning. Bruce moved again, this time without ceremony, without the settling period. He crossed the 11 feet between them in a time that Tadman later refused to estimate because any number he gave, he said, would sound like an exaggeration. He demonstrated 3 more movements in sequence, each one targeting a different structural gap in Lewis's defense, each one stopping fractionally short of contact. The third movement, a low-line kick targeting the nerve cluster 4 inches above the right knee, stopped 2 centimeters from its target. Lewis's leg buckled anyway. The same reflexive response, a nervous system answering a question it had not been asked aloud. Bruce stepped back again. He straightened his collar. He looked at Lewis with something that was not quite curiosity and not quite respect, but lived in the territory between them. 47 seconds. That was the total duration of the demonstration. 47 seconds that contained more information than most fighters accumulate in a decade of competition. Lewis stood completely still, not recovering, absorbing. The 4 other people in the room made a collective unspoken decision. They found reasons to exist near the walls. Ruiz examined the tape on the folding table with genuine seeming interest. Horton and Lewis's second training partner moved toward the stacked wrestling mats and began a quiet conversation that everyone understood was not a conversation at all, but an architecture of privacy extended to the 2 men in the center of the room. Joe Louis sat on the edge of a folding chair, not from exhaustion, because sitting was the honest physical response to what his mind was doing, which was the equivalent of reconstructing a building after discovering that 3 of its load-bearing walls were in different positions than the blueprints indicated. Bruce stood, not performing standing, simply standing, the same relaxed attention as when he had arrived, as though the last 47 seconds had required nothing from him, which, by his own accounting, they had not. Lewis looked up and said, "You're not fighting with Wing Chun." Bruce said, "Wing Chun is where I started. I'm not there anymore." Lewis said, "What does that mean?" Bruce was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of someone reading from something they have understood for a long time, but rarely explained. He said, "Every system is a collection of answers to specific questions. Wing Chun answers questions about close-range simultaneous attack and defense. Karate answers questions about power generation and range control. The problem isn't the answers. The problem is when you stop asking new questions because you're satisfied with the answers you have." Lewis said, "And you stop being satisfied." Bruce said, "I started noticing the questions the answers couldn't handle." This was the philosophical core of Jeet Kune Do, not a style, but the deliberate rejection of stylistic thinking. Bruce had developed it not from dissatisfaction with his own training, but from a specific observation that every martial art, no matter how sophisticated, was a selected solution to a selected problem. The opponent who arrived with a different problem revealed the style's boundaries immediately. The question was not which style was best. The question was whether you could release your style when the moment demanded something the style didn't contain. Be water, he had told his students. Water has no shape. Water takes the shape of whatever contains it. The container is the opponent. Your response must be the water. Lewis sat with this for perhaps 30 seconds. 30 seconds is a long time for a man of his physical precision to remain still. Then he said, "How long have you been working on this?" Bruce said, "My whole life." Lewis looked at his hands. He said, "When I was training in Okinawa, my instructor told me that the highest level of martial arts was when you could be completely natural. Nothing forced. Nothing prepared. Just response." Bruce said, "What did you think of that at the time?" Lewis said, "I thought it was something you said to students so they keep training." Bruce said, "And now?" Lewis looked up. There was something in his expression that Tadman, watching from the perimeter, later described as the look of a man who has spent years building a house and just discovered it is sitting 3 inches from where he thought the foundation was. Not collapsed, reoriented, exactly standing, but differently than before. Lewis said, "Now I think your instructor and my instructor were describing the same room from different doors." Bruce extended his hand, not the hand of a victor. There had been no contest, technically. The hand of a man who has met someone worth meeting. Lewis stood and took it, and for a moment they were simply two serious people who had understood each other with unusual efficiency. Then Lewis said the thing he would eventually, years later, tell his closest students. He said, "You should know. You're the most dangerous person I've ever been in a room with." Bruce said, "I hope you never have to use that information." Carlos Ruiz, from his position near the wall, heard both halves of that exchange. He said it was the most honest thing he had ever heard two fighters say to each other, and he had worked with fighters for 30 years. Years later, 1975, 8 years after that November evening on West Olympic Boulevard, Joe Louis would become the first karate world heavyweight champion, a title created partly to recognize what the sport had been building towards since exactly the period we've been discussing. He would win that championship using a style that his contemporaries noted was significantly different from his 1967 form. Looser, more economical, less committed to predetermined patterns, more willing to find the answer that the moment actually required rather than the answer his system had prepared. His students noticed the difference. One of them, a fighter named Marcus Chun who trained under Lewis in the late 1970s, described Lewis's teaching philosophy as organized around one persistent question. What does this situation actually require? Not what does your style require? Not what worked last time. What does this situation, this opponent, this precise moment require from you right now? Chun said Lewis repeated that question so consistently that it became the organizing principle of their entire curriculum. He said he asked Lewis once where the question came from. Lewis said, "From a room I was in once, with 6 people." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. The question itself contained the whole story. Bruce Lee died in July 1973, at 32 years old, before the full institutional recognition of Jeet Kune Do had crystallized. He left behind a body of work, notebooks, films, the students who carried his teaching. But he also left behind these rooms. These specific, unrecorded rooms where something was demonstrated that the formal record doesn't capture because the people present understood, implicitly, that what they had witnessed was not a performance for documentation. It was a private communication between two serious people about what was actually possible. The 6 people in that room on November 9th, 1967, carried the weight of that communication differently. Tadman occasionally alluded to it in interviews. Ruiz mentioned it once, obliquely, in a training manual that had a limited print run. Horton never discussed it publicly at all, but Lewis eventually let it into the room with his students, not as a story about Bruce Lee's skill, which is the easy reading, but as a story about the difference between a system and a mind. Now return to the opening image. The fluorescent light, the smell of liniment and cigarette smoke. The man sitting on the folding chair with his forearms on his knees. He is not defeated. He is recalibrating. That is the most important distinction. One moment, one adjustment, one philosophy that continued teaching long after the teacher was gone. Because that's what Joe Louis actually understood in that room. Not that he had been shown something impossible. He had been shown something completely possible. That was the revelation. Not that Bruce Lee defied the laws of combat, that he had followed laws so fundamental that Lewis's 61 matches of experience had only begun to approach them. The laws of efficiency, of honesty, of asking the question the moment actually requires. 47 witnesses in history books, 6 witnesses in that room, and one lesson that has traveled through every student Joe Louis ever taught, every correction he ever offered, every time he asked a fighter, what does this moment actually require? The lesson doesn't need many witnesses to travel far. Water doesn't need permission to find its level. And somewhere in the notebooks Bruce Lee left behind, in the careful handwriting of a man who spent his life asking questions, there's a line that reads, "The great mistake is to anticipate the outcome of the engagement. You ought not to be thinking of whether it ends in victory or defeat. Let nature take its course, and your tools will strike at the right moment." Joe Louis understood that line on November 9th, 1967, in a room with 5 other people. He spent the rest of his career teaching it without ever quite naming its source. But there's one evening Bruce Lee never discussed publicly, a conversation that happened 6 months after this one, in a different city, with a different fighter, that changed the direction of Jeet Kune Do's development in a way nobody has fully mapped. The people present agreed, unanimously, to keep it among themselves. What they agreed to keep, and why, that is a story for another time.